In this video, we're going to look at some what I call unusual spots. They're spots which can arise in or around the bubble where the strategy is kind of counterintuitive. It's something that you might not expect. The first situation I'm going to look at is an example where we have a runaway chip leader. So we have a satellite with only 2 seats. The chip leader has 50 big blinds and the other 2 players have 5 big blinds each. And the chip leader is on the button. So the question is, what should the shoving range here be? The chip leader has so many chips that even if he gets it in and loses, it's not going to affect him too much. If he gets it in and wins, the satellite's over. So a lot of people think that the answer to this problem is that the button should shove any 2. Actually, it's completely different. The solution is the button should fold any 2, even aces. And this was sent to me a while back by a student who was convinced that it was a mistake, that Hold'em Resources calculator was malfunctioning. You can see that it's saying that every single hand loses 0.13% of the prize pool as a shove. And that just seems wrong. Like, how can aces be losing the same as 3-2 off? How can aces even be losing? If the button shoves, he's only getting called by aces. So how can aces be a losing shove? The answer is that shoving aces is profitable, but it's not as profitable as folding. And the reason for that is, if the button does fold, the small blind is supposed to shove 76.1% of the time. And the big blind is supposed to call 68.4% of the time. And obviously when that happens, except in rare cases, in rare cases where there's a chop, the satellite's going to be over. One player is going to knock the other one out, since they have equal stacks in this case. So that's why it's more profitable to fold, because by folding, 76.1% of the time small blind is going to shove, 68.4% he's going to get called. If you sum those 2 probabilities, it comes in at roughly 50%. So there's a 50% chance that by folding, you're going to actually win the seat this hand. Whereas if you shove, yeah, most of the time you will, you'll add the blinds to your stack, but that's not as good as ending the satellite there and then. So, and this is a general principle. I mean, this is obviously a slightly artificial example in that the small blind and the big blind have exactly the same stacks. But it is a general principle that when you have a much bigger stack than the other 2, it can actually be profitable to fold and let them get it in. So, okay, let's change the example slightly. We'll give the small blind slightly more chips than the big blind and see if that changes the solution. So the button is still runaway chip leader with 50 big blinds. The small blind has 6 big blinds and the big blind has 5 big blinds. And the solution is still the same. Button is supposed to fold everything. The small blind is supposed to shove 76.3%. The big blind is supposed to call 68.3%. So they're getting in against each other about roughly half the time. Some of the time, obviously, the big blind will win and the small blind will be left with 1 big blind. But that's still a better situation than just taking the shove and taking the blinds. And this is an advanced play you will often see at the end of satellites, which good players realize. When it's folded around to the button and the button has a comfortable amount of chips, but the 2 players in the blinds are the 2 shortest, then the button will fold and let them get it in. Okay, but what if the players in the blinds don't realize how wide they're supposed to get it in? What if the small blind doesn't realize he's supposed to shove 76% of hands, and the big blind doesn't realize he's supposed to call off so wide? Because these 2 guys are so short, they're effectively competing for a seat. So the big blind is calling almost as wide as the small blind is shoving, and both players should be wide, but that might not be the case. So let's imagine the small blind is afraid of getting called. So he's not going to shove 70% of hands. Say he's going to shove roughly 50% of hands. And the big blind similarly doesn't realize that he's supposed to call very wide, and he's actually calling significantly too tight. Let's say he's calling roughly 30%. So now what happens? Now what happens is the button's supposed to shove any 2, because now they're not getting it in often enough. The small blind's only going to shove half the time. Big blind's only call 30% of the time. So that's only 15% of the time that they're getting it in. So folding and letting them get it in 15% of the time isn't as good as shoving now in this case and just taking up the blinds. But we could complicate the matter further by saying that the guys are going to call too wide, for example. So let's imagine the small blind, instead of calling 2.7% of hands, thinks he's supposed to go with roughly 10%. And the big blind, instead of going with 5.4% of hands, thinks he's supposed to go with, let's say, roughly 20%. And now we're back to sort of a quasi-limbo situation where, because we're getting called more often, we can't shove any two. But at the same time, because they're not getting it in often enough, we can't just fold everything. So we end up shoving a fairly wide range. The next situation I want to look at is when it's the bubble and two players are already all in. How tight should we cover? Should we call off? And there's obviously a couple of factors. One is whether we cover the players involved and how much we cover them by. Another is, if we're covered by them, should we call wider? Should we call tighter? These are the factors. So let's set up a situation. Again, it's the bubble, 7 players left, 6 seats of equal value. The 2 players who are going to be all in are under the gun, who has 8 big blinds, and mid position, who has 12, or low jack. And then the players behind I've deliberately given them more chip. Each player has more chips than the players behind, so he doesn't have to worry about a player behind waking up with something. So the hijack has 30 big blinds, cutoff has 20, button has 15. All those players cover the 2 all-in players. The small blind covers under the gun, but not the other all-in player. And the big blind covers neither player. So what does that mean for the calling ranges? Let's have a look. So when under the gun shoves, he should be shoving this kind of range here. And then the next player, the low jack in this case, since it's a 7-seat table, he basically needs kings or aces. So that's kind of a crucial factor here. The fact that he's so tight, that makes the calling ranges behind super tight. Now, even the hijack, who covers both players comfortably, is supposed to wait for aces. Similarly, the cutoff needs aces and the button needs aces. So all of those players can only call off with aces. The blinds are even more interesting, since the small blind is covered by the player who has the very tight range. So even when he has aces, he's supposed to fold. Because his best shot, obviously, is this player who has the very tight range will knock out this player who has the wider range. And the big blind is in the same boat. Even though he's super short, calling with aces is actually a huge mistake. Loses 2.98. So in this spot, they're all better off basically waiting, because this player has such a tight range, he's probably going to knock this guy out. Okay, now let's change the situation slightly. So what I've done is I've swapped the under the gun and low jack stacks. So under the gun now covers the low jack. And let's see what effect that has. When you run that, you find that under the gun is actually supposed to go super wide. And we know this from previous examples, that the calling range will have to be very tight, because it's the bubble, he can go super wide. So he's the one with the wide range. Therefore, the player behind, who only has 8 big blinds, actually is only supposed to call off aces now. So this is a very different situation. This time it's the covered player who has the tighter range. So because of that, the calling ranges behind now are a bit wider than we saw in the previous example. The hijack, who has 30 big blinds, can call off 10s plus. Actually, 10s is just barely better than break even, but it is still a call, because this player has a wide range. This player is probably not going to lose, so folding and allowing the covered player to get knocked out is not going to happen very often. So therefore, it's better to take the shot to knock out the guy with the wide range, who only has 12 big blinds. So he's calling with 10s. The next player is 1 seat later, so you might think that makes his calling range wider, but actually he has 20 big blinds. So losing 12 big blinds is much worse for him than the 30 big blind stack. So therefore he's actually calling a tighter range. In fact, jacks is barely better than break even for him now. Similarly, the button again has less chips and he's even tighter. So you can see the stack is more important than position in this case. If the button calls off and loses to under the gun, he's actually going to be the one who bubbles. So he has to be very tight. He needs queens, kings, races. And the same continues on. The small blind is definitely knocked out if he loses to under the gun, so he can only call aces. And the big blind, even though he's the shortest, if he loses the main pot or the side pot, he's out. So therefore, he's supposed to call super tight, and again, he can't even call aces. The next situation I want to look at is where there's a microstack. So somebody is really short and he moves all in and somebody else calls, and I want to see how tight we should call off. So we'll set this one up as an advanced hand because we don't want to force the players behind to move all in. They can just call. So I've set it up so that the big blind or the under the gun has 2 big blinds and all the other guys cover him comfortably. 30 big blinds, 20, 15, 10, and actually the big blind only has 6, just to make it slightly interesting. So we've set it up so that no limping, but they can open to 2 big blinds, which will be all in for the short stack. So we'll when we run that, this is the result here. The under the gun is supposed to shove this range, and again, this might be tighter than you think. Like a lot of people would think maybe we're just supposed to go with an above average hand here, since we have 2 big blinds and we're going to have to post the big blind next hand. But actually, the range is still reasonably tight. This is a plus 10% range. So when he shoves that range, let's look first of all at the calling ranges of the players behind. So you might be surprised by how tight the call. First of all, just note that there's no 3-betting or shoving. All the players behind are either calling or folding, because raising or shoving makes no sense in this case. If you have a hand strong enough to call, you don't mind players behind also throwing in 2 big blinds and essentially ganging up on the short stack, and more chance that he bubbles then. So, but nevertheless, you don't just want to get involved just for the sake of it. So even the 30 big blind stack just behind, his calling range is actually quite tight. He's supposed to fold 10s. He's supposed to fold ace queen, king queen suited, etc. So he's not supposed to call too wide, even though it's only 2 big blinds. Similarly, the next player over hijack, he's a little bit wider. He also has 30 big blinds, but again, it's a pretty tight range. By the time we get to the cutoff has 20 big blinds, and we're still pretty much the same. In fact, it's exactly the same range, 10s plus, ace queen plus. The button has 15 big blinds, and that actually tightens his range up. Now 10s and ace queen off go out of the range because every blind is more important to him. So he shouldn't be calling too wide at all. The small blind, who has 15 big blinds, he can actually call very wide because he's obviously got half a blind in already. So he's only putting in 1.5 big blinds. So he's getting a discount. And similarly, the big blind is basically supposed to call any 2 because of the price he's getting and the chance to end it. So you can see that it's really only the blinds who are calling very wide. So let's say that under the gun shoves and the next player does actually call. Now let's look at the calling ranges of the players behind. And again, you'll see there's no shoving. Everybody is just either calling or folding. And the same pattern emerges. The players in the next few seats have to be very, very tight, even though they have quite a lot of chips. The 30 big blind stack and the low jack is only calling queens, kings, and aces. The 20 big blind stack and the cutoff is only calling queens, kings, and aces, and the button's also only calling queens, kings, and aces. The button only has 15 big blinds, so again, he's kind of in preservation mode, no need to get involved. The small blind in this case is actually a lot tighter than in the previous example we saw, because this guy has the tighter range. He's probably going to knock him out. So that's better than putting in an extra 1.5 big blinds with a weak hand. And then if the short stack does somehow win, he more than trebles up. And that puts the small blind in a bad situation. Similarly, the big blind, even though he only has to call off one big blind, is actually better off folding. So the general principle is you have to be very tight in these spots, a lot tighter than you would think when a microstack shoves. But when somebody else calls, you have to be even tighter again. Okay, the last situation I want to look at is when there's what I call a leftover prize. Sometimes a satellite won't have an equal number of seats. There'll be enough, for example, for say 5 seats, and then there's some amount of cash left over, and that's paid out to 6th place. So the question is, how much does that affect our strategy when there's 7 left? Is that the real bubble, or is the bubble when there are 6 left and we're playing for the seats? And the answer, as you probably can intuit, is it kind of depends on the size of the 6th prize. But we'll start with looking just at if it was a normal bubble where there are 7 players left and there are 6 seats, and we've seen this several times before. It's just a case of all the players are supposed to be shoving any 2 because the players behind can't call anything. So now let's look at the situation where let's say there was only 5 seats. So 6th is getting 0. And so it's 7 left, 5 seats, so it's not the exact bubble. So what you would find then in that situation is, because it's not the exact bubble, the players in the early seats can't shove any 2. They can still shove very wide, but they're not supposed to shove any 2 because it's not the exact bubble yet. So they will get called more. Okay, what about if there is a 6th prize, but it's not equal to the value of a seat? So let's imagine it's just a small consolation prize of 1, which is 1/10 of the value of a seat. What happens in this case? You can see that there's very little difference between this case and this case. The small consolation prize makes little or no difference, and it's dramatically different from this case. So it's not really the bubble. It's actually not that different from this situation at all. Okay, what if we make the consolation prize bigger? So let's say it's 70% of the value of a seat, 7 units in this case. And now when we run it again, now we see that this is the bubble. This is the actual bubble. So again, we're back to an any 2 range. So the general principle here is that when the cash prize is significant, as in a significant portion of the seat, then when you're on the bubble for the cash prize, that's the real bubble, and you play your normal bubble strategy. But when the cash prize is small, it's only a small fraction of a seat, then it's not really the bubble. It's in fact more or less the same situation as 2 off the bubble.